Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to round 6 coverage of the 2015 Women's World Chess Championship. So round 6 is the final round. The field has been narrowed down to 2 players. We have Mariya Muzychuk from the Ukraine playing against Natalia Pogonina from Russia. And the final round is in the form of a 4-game match. So there are 4 games played at classical time controls over 4 days, and then if the match is still tied at that point, then there's a tie-break day where they play a series of rapid and blitz games. So the game I want to look at is game 2 from the match. Mariya Muzychuk has the white pieces and Natalia Pogonina has the black pieces. The first round game was the first game of the match was a draw. So the players are both tied up at this point. And Mariya is looking to score first blood with her first chance with the white pieces. So she kicks off with e4, and we get a Ruy Lopez. And these first few moves, I've actually covered this in my Chess Basics series, the Ruy Lopez. I covered it up to about move 9, which is, we follow the main line actually up to this point. So this is the main line of the closed Ruy Lopez. So both pawns go to the center, a knight attacks the pawn, the knight defends it. The bishop comes out to put pressure on the knight. Black kicks the bishop back. Bishop stays on this diagonal. And black develops a piece, attacking the pawn in the center. And white ignores that and castles. And if black takes, that's a playable move, but that goes into a line known as the open Ruy Lopez. The main line is the closed Ruy Lopez. The typical move here is bishop e7. But the move b5, which was played, can be played in either order. You can either play bishop e7 first and then b5, or b5, kicking the bishop back, and then bishop e7. So that's just a minor move order wrinkle. It doesn't really have any great independent significance. And it's just that at this point, black has a number of choices besides bishop e7. For example, I like to play the move bishop to c4 right in this position. But bishop e7 transposes back into the main line. So we have the absolute main line of one of the most popular of all openings. So rook e1, finally defending the pawn. d6, black shores up her center. c3, preparing to build up a big center with d4. Black castles. And now h3 to prevent the bishop from coming out and pinning the knight. And right here, black has a number of choices. In fact, this is where I stopped my coverage in the Chess Basics series because, well, the lines go on and on. You have to stop at some point. And right here, there's a big branching. So to cover any more would require quite a few more videos. So the 3 main moves, and actually there are lots more playable moves for black besides these. You don't just have to play these 3 moves. But the 3 main moves are bishop to b7, the Zaitsev variation, knight to a5, the Chigorin variation, and knight to b8, the Breyer variation. And the Breyer variation is what's played here. Now notice that 2 of those moves are knight moves, and the idea is to one of the ideas is to get the knight out of the way of the pawn push. And with the Breyer, the idea is also to reroute the knight to the square d7, where it might have a more useful role. From d7, it can defend the f6 knight and also jump into c5, which we'll see actually in this game. We'll see that kind of plan with the knight. So very typical of the Breyer variation. Just the Chigorin has a similar idea, getting the knight out of the way of the pawn. It comes with the tempo. So in a way, this is actually the most popular move, the Chigorin, because it puts pressure on this bishop. White doesn't want to trade it. So just to show you, Chigorin would go like this. Knight here, bishop drops back, and then c5. And white usually plays d4 here, setting up this central tension. And the most common move here for black is queen c7, shoring up the center. This pawn is a bit weak right now. So the knight is a bit stuck on the rim for the moment, but it'll reroute back to the game. And lots of games have been played from this point. We're backing up to give you an idea of the Breyer variation. That's the move bishop to b7. And this is interesting. Doesn't move the knight right away, but this knight will be moved at a later point. But first, black wants to reorganize her pieces a little bit. So d4 here, and rook to e1. So both these moves aimed at putting pressure indirectly on the not that arrow, indirectly on the e-pawn. Knight bd2 is a normal move, and then bishop to f8, dropping back here. So this completes the reorganization, and black will follow up with the move g6 and bishop to g7. The rook is on a good file, and this bishop can later move out of the way to a number of different squares. It could even come here, as well as these other squares. And then the move c5 will be played, as in other Ruy Lopez, just to gain space on the queen side. So the only wrinkle with the Zaitsev, and the reason why I wanted to show it a little bit, is that instead of knight d2, if white is interested in playing for a draw, he can actually force black either to change what he's playing or accept a draw, because this move knight g5 attacks this f7 pawn, which the rook just undefended. So the rook has to go back and defend the pawn, and then the knight can drop back to f3. And if black insists on playing the Zaitsev with rook to e8, then white can insist on the draw. Of course, black doesn't have to repeat, but the point is that white can force black to either repeat moves or to go to a different line and not play exactly the moves of the Zaitsev. Anyway, kind of an interesting wrinkle. Let's go back to the game. So in the game, the Breyer variation was chosen. That's knight to b8. So the knight drops back here and gives white the opportunity to play d4, so she takes that, puts the pawn in the center, and now the knight b to d7. The knight's rerouting right away. And the most common move for white here is to play knight b d2, and it will make the typical kind of knight maneuver you see to g3 or maybe even to e3. Typical Ruy Lopez knight maneuver. We have a very closed position at this point. There's some tension in the center, so potentially it could open up, but right now it's very closed, and no pieces or pawns have been exchanged. Mariya chooses the move a4, bit of a sideline here, although this move a4 is an idea in many variations of the Ruy Lopez. It's pretty logical. It puts pressure on this little pawn construction that black has created here on the queen side, and it's threatening just to take the pawn immediately because there's a pin. If we erase this arrow, there's a pin along the a file because the rook is unprotected. So that's two moves for black in this position, either rook to b8, just getting away from the pin, or bishop to b7, defending the rook and dealing with the pin that way. And after knight b d2, there's no more point in taking immediately. Black is not going to take, because that would just mess up black's pawn structure for no particular gain. And so white is going to leave this tension here and perhaps take that pawn on b5 at a later time when it's more appropriate. So just continuing development of knight b d2, c5, and all these moves have been played before. We're still in the opening book, so it's entirely possible that the players were just reeling out these moves from memory at this point. So I don't know the exact timing on the moves. But here there's a choice. White can continue to sort of reorganize her pieces with bishop to c2, leaving the tension in the center, or she can push on with d5. And Mariya chose to close up the position with d5. And this is an interesting point to do it because the bishop over here on b7 is somewhat hampered by these pawns in the center, and black is going to have to waste some time redeploying this bishop. So anyway, but c4 is played. Black accepts the closed position, kicks the bishop back, and then plants the knight on c5. So the Breyer knight, has made this complete journey and posted to an excellent square here. And the d5 move that white played, although it shut in the bishop, it also opened up this square on c5 for black's knight. So it was a move with pluses and minuses. And this knight is very difficult to chase away. It can sit there, and it's a good square. The pawn push to try and chase the knight away is met by the en passant capture. So that knight is not going anywhere. It's going to be a feature of the position for a while. But white still has a lot of ideas in this position as well. It's still a closed position. Still no exchanges have taken place. And white continues with the typical knight maneuver, knight to f1, rook to e8, placing the rook on the central file, and now we're setting up for that typical maneuver we saw from the Zaitsev with the bishop back here, and maybe even fianchettoing the bishop at some point. The knight hops into g3, completing this knight maneuver, and g6 was played, preparing this maneuver. And also, the g6 pawn keeps the knight out of the f4 square, f5 square rather, which this is a dangerous attacking square, the knight to f5, so something that the black player always has to be careful of in the Ruy Lopez. So g6 is a dual-purpose move. Okay, bishop to e3. And now queen to c7, just getting the queen off the back rank, putting it hopefully on a useful diagonal, although it's not clear that these pawns really need support of the queen. I think the main idea is to get the queen out of the way of the other pieces. This route, either knight might want to use the e7 square as a d7 square as a way to reroute, and of course the rooks want to be connected. So knight d2 was played. Now the other knight starts to maneuver. This is getting out of the way of the f-pawn. One of the few breaks in this position is the f4 break. And also, f3 might be useful here just to shore up the center. So there's a couple ideas getting the knight out of the way of the f-pawn. Bishop drops back to f8, preparing to fianchetto. Queen goes to e2. And knight fd7. This knight, yeah. So taking advantage of the d7 square, the knight wants to reroute and also frees up this f-pawn from moving either to f6 or f5. And now white plays the move f3. And right here, finally, we're actually out of my opening book. So all of these moves have been played before, which is why I was just kind of going through them. It's a very interesting position. It's closed, and it's possible that the next few moves have also been played before as well. It's just that my opening book ends after 20 moves, so this is as far as it goes. So they could still be repeating moves from some other game at this point. I don't know when it first actually enters novel territory, but it's pretty interesting these openings go so deep, particularly the most topical, most popular openings like the Ruy Lopez. Really one of the most popular openings in all of chess. So f3, shoring up the center, and now knight b6. So this knight has got its own route planned. It's going to come over here and put some pressure on the queen side, hitting this pawn. So the pawn goes forward, and another step to closing up the position has taken place. Whenever you see these kind of configurations, there's very little opportunity for pawn breaks, so that's really has closed things up quite a bit. There are still a few potential breaks here. There's these f-pawn breaks, and perhaps the b-pawn breaks are possible too, for both sides. Either black or white could be thinking about at some point pushing forward those b or f-pawns to break things up. Okay, the knight goes back to d7, having provoked this pawn push and closed up the queen side. This also frees the a-rook, the rook here, to to move. And it's no longer doing anything on the a file, so it's going to find another spot. And so white chooses at this point to start a queenside expansion. It's interesting that the chess engine does not really approve of this plan, but it doesn't suggest any particular refutation of it. It's just it doesn't think that's the best move in the position. And I am inclined not to believe the computer in these cases. Basically, it's such a closed position that any real action is too deep, and the computer can't really calculate far enough ahead to figure out exactly what's going on. So it's basing its calculation on some sort of general rules and scoring of the position, which is not always accurate. So anyway, the idea of the knight h1 was to get out of the way of the g-pawn and push this pawn forward and maybe expand on the king side. And this is, I guess, a typical strategy of the Ruy Lopez is for white to just try and lock things up in the center and the queen side, and then just migrate all the pieces over to the king side and just slowly build up pressure until black finally cracks. And so we see this is a very characteristic move. Or plan in the Ruy Lopez, and we get to watch Mariya try and execute this plan. Now queen to d8 was played. It's interesting that this bishop never went to the g7 square. It went to f8 and then it came back here. It looks like after this knight h1 and maneuver that well, let's see, let's take a look at the point. Yeah, it was right after knight h1. It looked like Natalia spotted the opportunity to bring the bishop to a good square and decided to bring it over on this side. So g4 was played, queen d8 now, reinforcing the idea of bringing the bishop out on this diagonal. Queen goes to f2, You would think that's kind of strange, just walking into the skewer, but Mariya has a plan. Bishop to h4 was played, and then knight to g3. So the knight just got out of the way of the pawn and then went back to this good square on g3, and it also protects the queen there. So rook to c8 was played. Finally, the a rook gets to go to a slightly more active square. King goes up to g2, defending the knight so the queen is free to move. And now black starts a maneuver with her knight. She drops it back to f8. And this opens up some squares for other pieces to use. Maybe there's some ideas of defending laterally we'll see later in the game. The rook goes to f1, so clearly white, Mariya, is preparing to push forward on the f-pawn, open it up and try and break through. So bishop to g5, and f4 is played. And now, after 28 moves, we get the first exchange. It's a fork, so you got to take the pawn somehow. So pawn takes was played, bishop takes, and now rook to c7. So the idea with the knight going back to f8, we see, is to prepare this defense along the 7th rank of the f-pawn. So after rook c7, Mariya decides to trade off the dark squared bishop. And so we have a position where the first trade of a piece has happened, and so we can try and figure out whose pieces are better at this point. Did that trade benefit white or black? And it's still not entirely clear. So this light squared bishop of black's is still biting on these pawns, but it can reroute to other diagonals, so it's not completely out of the game. And white's bishop is supporting the e-pawn, which is a useful role at this point. This is a key property of a key piece in white's setup, this e-pawn. But also the e-pawn might get pushed forward at some point to open up this diagonal. So this bishop, although it's blocked by a center pawn and technically a bad bishop, it also has some good qualities too. So I would say the position is still about balanced. So knight to f3 was played, kicking the queen. You get a little bit of maneuvering. The queen drops back to e7. Also, the chess engine rates the position is about even too, so for what it's worth. The knight goes to d4. So one advantage you see of that f-pawn push is that when the e-pawn took the f-pawn, it opened up the square for the knight. The e-pawn is no longer there to chase that knight away. So white's managed to improve one of her pieces, at least. The queen goes forward to e5. And this move here is maybe the first little mistake in the game. Somehow white seems to get some activity after this. The chess engine is suggesting a good move here is knight f to d7. So the knight got out of the way momentarily, and it's just hard, I suppose. Black has tried to set up this 7th rank defense, so it doesn't make a lot of sense immediately to put the knight on d7. But while the queen and the king are still adequately defending the f7 pawn, and the knight could usefully deploy to the d5 square. I think that's the main point here. So instead, Natalia chose to put the queen on e5. And now white picks up a couple of tempos here. So starting with the move h4, this queen is subject to later tempo gain, I should say that way. h6 is played, trying to keep things closed over here on the king side. Now, any pawn push would be met by a push of the opposing pawn just to keep a locked up the other pawn. So if white pushes here, black pushes here, and just to keep a locked up structure around the king, not allowing any open lines. Queen to d2 is played, hitting the pawn on h6. And instead of defending the pawn, which actually one idea of the queen on e5 might be to drop back to g7 and defend the pawn, but Natalia goes for the counterattack, bishop to c8, attacking this g-pawn. So 2 pawns are hanging, and knight to c6 is played here. And this is the tempo gain I was talking about. The knight jumps into c6 at the moment when the bishop is no longer defending that square, hitting the queen, and the queen drops back to g7. So the queen had a nice square prepared. This pawn is now defended. The g-pawn is still hanging, so white brings her queen forward to f4 to defend. And so if we can pause and take stock, it seems like these transactions have actually improved white's position a little bit. The queen is now better centralized. The knight's on a good square, and black's queen has been driven back from the center. So it seems like a slight improvement for white has taken place here. So rook to d7 was played. This d-pawn was under attack, so had to be defended. Now rook to f2, preparing to just double on the f-file. Another example of this strategy in the Ruy Lopez of building up pressure on the king side, just slowly, step by step, gathering space and just increasing the pressure. So the bishop goes to b7, chasing this knight away so the queen can get back to e5. The knight drops back to d4. And now rook to e5 was played. I thought, that could not have been played while the knight was there. So chasing the knight away so the rook can use that square. But the knight drops back to f3, hitting the rook. Rook drops back to e8. So just a little bit of a dance of the pieces. Now white's not interested in repeating, but she goes on with g5. So this fixes the structure on the king side, but it also gains space for white. So continuing to increase the pressure just bit by bit. And now the knight goes to d4 again. And this time the queen comes to e5. That was the moment I was thinking of earlier. So offering the queen trade. And in this position, white's not interested in the queen trade. She's got to keep the pieces on, I think, is the best strategy as she's trying to increase pressure and find a way to break through to the enemy king. So she drops her queen back to d2. Now rook to c7 was played. This d-pawn no longer needed to be defended, and this d7 square might be useful for other pieces to use. Okay, rook a to f1. More pressure on the f-file. Rook e to e7, so lifting this rook up, defending along the 7th rank still. And the rook goes forward to f6. Pretty interesting move. Just we see some maneuvers on the f-file. White owns the f-file and can play a number of different moves here to try and poke and prod and look for weaknesses. So it's putting a little bit of pressure on the d-pawn. It's also threatening to trap the queen. The queen has nowhere to go if a move like knight to f3 were played. So this rook goes to d7, freeing up an exit square for the queen. And the rook just drops back to f4. And at this point, Natalia decides to try and get some counterplay. It's really tough to just sit in a position like this and wait for your opponent to make threats and try and deal with them. Although the engine is recommending some kind of wait and sit and wait strategy with a move like bishop to a8 or knight to h7. I guess knight to h7 does a little something. It tries to control the f6 square a little bit. Anyway, basically a do-nothing strategy is what the chess engine is recommending here. Natalia pushes on with b4, trying to open up a second front over on the queen side, maybe get some counterplay. And this is where black has the more space. So white's playing on the king side, and black has to get counterplay on the queen side. And she may have been thinking about a line like this. If white takes right away, this was not played, then knight to d3 is a nice little resource here. The knight hops into the square, protected by the pawn, hitting the rook, and also this knight is hanging. So this actually wins an exchange. The best play would go, say, knight to e2, defending the knight, and knight takes rook check, and queen takes. But still, this position is, it's about even. White has compensation for the exchange, so it's not like it's winning, but it would be an interesting way for play and probably something Natalia was looking forward to. But after b4, Mariya just played knight f3, kicking the queen and getting the knight off of that square so it wouldn't be loose, as we saw in the previous line. In this position, Natalia played queen to g7, just retreating the knight. Retreating the queen away from the knight. But there was an interesting possibility the chess engine pointed out. I don't know if she considered this during the game, but it was possible to take the pawn on c3 as well, because that attacks the enemy queen. So the play might have continued. B takes c3, knight takes queen, b takes queen on d2, and knight takes d7, grabbing the exchange. Knight f d7, getting the knight off the back rank, and rook to f2, trying to round up the pawn. So if we pause to count, in this position, black has given up the exchange. But, well, there's some compensation here. I guess this pawn is going to be rounded up, but white will lose some time. And there's some weaknesses in white's position. And this advanced c-pawn looks pretty good. So this would have been an interesting way to play. But, well, it's going into an endgame, and it's not clear that this is any good for black. Maybe white is still winning with best play. It does give up the exchange, but it's just an interesting option there. So in the game, queen g7 was played, and now white can play the move c takes b4, grabbing the pawn. And now when the knight comes to d3, similar to the other variation we looked at, there's no loose knight on d4 in this case. So the rook is hit, the knight comes here and hits the rook. White could exchange off the knight, but, well, she chose to play rook f6, an interesting choice, putting this back on a good square. And now knight to h7, hitting the rook and trying to chase it away. And the knight, so instead of moving the rook again, knight to d4 was played, giving up the exchange. So an interesting exchange sacrifice, but well, white gets some interesting compensation here. So knight takes rook, and not rook takes, but pawn takes was played. And this queen is almost trapped back here. How is the queen ever going to get out of this box? I guess through the e-file. Anyway, gaining influence over some more key squares in black's camp. So continuing this strangulation strategy we get in the Ruy Lopez. And now bishop to a4, threatening to grab the rook here and get the exchange back. In fact, Natalia gives back the exchange here with the move knight e5. If you play a move like rook d8, just trying to get away, I mean, that's the only move. The rook can't go here, so it would have to drop back. Then knight takes h5 is a really dangerous move. So this is an interesting line here. Knight takes h5, and if you grab the knight, if black grabs the knight here, then this is a winning attack, starting with rook f5. The rook is coming forward, and this queen is potentially coming into this square, delivering a check, and this is all very dangerous, and actually it's a winning attack for white. So if we back up, after knight takes h5, you can't even take the knight. You've got to play some other move, like king h8 is being recommended, or rook to b8. So anyway, interesting way to play, but that looks like that's all good for white. So Natalia chose to give back the exchange here with the move knight to e5, getting this knight to a good central square, defending some of these key squares around the king, but giving the exchange back. So bishop takes rook was played. And now rook takes. So what's happened here? Natalia won the exchange and then gave it back. And in the meantime, Mariya has picked up a pawn. So there's an extra pawn on the queen side. And as a result of this transaction, actually white is doing quite well. This knight is now in a role to defend, and the rook and the queen are playing pretty well, but this bishop is still stuck over here on b7, and never did manage to find a way back into the game. So anyway, Mariya continued with knight to f3, just challenging this knight here, and the knight from e5 jumps into the g4 square. She doesn't want to give up the knight or trade off any more pieces, and is looking to try and round up the pawn on f6. But now this tactic, knight takes h5, is played. So we get to see the tactical finish here, similar to that other variation I showed earlier. After knight takes h5, g takes is not the best move. The engine is once again recommending some other move like bishop to c8, just giving up. But then black is just 2 pawns down. So taking is really the way to try and stay into the game. But now the queen comes here with the check. Queen to g5, the king goes to h8, the only move. Queen takes h5, check. Now the knight defends with knight to h6, but this is all pretty hopeless. The king, first of all, steps to the side, king to h2, just to get out of the way of any counter checks from black's queen, and also opening up the g-file for the rook, which is going to be the final blow. Queen to g8 was played, and now rook to g1. And black resigned in this position. So it's just game over. There's no way to defend all the many threats. So, for example, the chess engine line goes queen f8 and then rook to g7. So the rook can just drop right down into this key square. Notice that black's bishop over here is still not playing, and the pressure on f7 is getting pretty fierce. The engine is giving queen takes g8, giving up the queen for the rook. If you don't play that, if you move, well, let's see, what is a move? Say you go here. Then queen takes h6 is mate. I just wanted to show that. That's the threat. So you're covering everything here. So at this point, after rook g1, then Natalia resigned. So this win gave Mariya the victory. The next two games were very exciting and tactical affairs as Natalia strove to come back, but she was unable to score her fourth comeback. She came back from a position of being down a game in three previous matches, but the fourth time she wasn't able to do it, and both of those two games ended in draws, but they were interesting to look at, so you might want to check it out. Anyway, as a result of that, Mariya Muzychuk won the match and the Women's World Championship for 2015. So congratulations to Mariya, and good work, everybody else. A lot of interesting chess in this tournament. Hope you guys enjoyed this coverage, and I'll be seeing you again soon. Bye.